With the addition of the new 665 exquisite tome weapons from Criterion Savage in Final Fantasy XIV, the topic of best in slot's relevancy has been stirring a lot within the community. It's a simple question with a complicated answer. Does best in slot gear matter? Let's take a look at the state of Final Fantasy XIV's gearing, what these new weapons mean, and why best in slot mattering depends a lot on who you are as a player. Hopefully at the end, you'll have a better idea about if it matters to you or not. First, let's start with the basics. Just in case you're not familiar with it, best in slot refers to the best possible piece of gear that you could be using right now for a gear slot. Most of the time, this means picking between two options. In the endgame, you have augmented tome gear and savage raid gear. Tome gear and raid gear have different stat allocations, and one will always be better than the other. Generally, we figure out which one has better stats by relying on smart players doing math in communities like The Balance. You're often going to be using a mixture of both tome gear and raid gear, which means that to achieve best in slot, you must do savage raiding. Typically, people go to places like The Balance to figure out what their best in slot looks like so they can target those specific pieces. I personally like using etro.gg because it has a convenient list to show me all of the jobs and what their best in slot sets are. Notice that I said sets, since jobs can have different best in slot sets based on comfort and player preference. For example, you might prefer a different GCD speed because the rotation feels a little smoother even if it leads to slightly less damage. Likewise, healers may run a set that's slightly less optimal for one job because it works the best for multiple jobs at the same time, since a lot of healers will play more than one job in the role. Healers can also choose to sacrifice some damage for increased piety, which usually isn't a big deal but may help when you need more MP regen, especially in prog scenarios. Best in slot is a big goal for a lot of people and an accomplishment in and of itself. It's no surprise that people want the best gear. You do more damage, get more health, and you can diet. What's not to like? It's a reward for those players who choose to face some of the hardest content in the game. It even gets a little more complicated too, because if you run ultimates, best in slot changes because of the stricter item level sync. That's how we end up in situations where even though the raid gear is 660 and the dungeon gear is currently 635, some of the dungeon gear is better for the Omega Protocol, for example. The same is true for using Abyssos gear over Anabasios gear, since the stat allocations are better when you factor in materia. This means that at any given time, an endgame raider may have multiple best in slot gear sets at the same time depending on the content that they like to do. These stat allocations are also how we run into weird situations like the current healer best in slot. It uses one augmented and one unaugmented tome ring, instead of a savage ring. The reason for this is that the savage ring has piety, which is typically an unwanted stat since it doesn't help with damage and MP economy is good enough already. Now, let's talk about the new kid on the block, Criterion Savage. With the release of Alo Alo Island, we now have a taste of Square's efforts to improve the Criterion rewards. This new Criterion dungeon now gives an item that you can exchange to upgrade augmented tome weapons from 660 to 665. These weapons are statistically the same as the Savage weapons, which makes them also best in slot. Because of this, we now have multiple content options for best in slot when it comes to getting your weapon. As unrealistic as it may be for most people, you could gear up from the first 3 floors of a Savage tier and then switch to Criterion Savage instead of finishing the 4th floor. What's really interesting about this is since the 4th floor at this point is still on a weekly lockout, if you haven't cleared by now or haven't been lucky enough to roll in a weapon or a coffer, Savage Criterion offers a guaranteed way of getting your best in slot weapon instead of having to clear P12S up to 8 times if your RNG is bad. I think that this is a pretty big deal. Now there are some arguments against this, such as Criterion Savage seeming too hard, or at least harder than a 4th floor fight can be to some people, and while that may or may not be true, I think it's great to have more options anyway. Some people feel like these weapons also just came out too late. I think what they're missing is that even if it's late with Alo Alo Island, if future Criterion dungeons operate in the same way, this could be a huge deal. Let's look at the last Criterion release. It came out roughly 2 months after the Savage tier dropped. For some people, they may not have cleared P12 by then, or at least not enough times to get a weapon. If they have an easier time finding 3 players instead of 7, it's a valid option. That said, the real question is why? Why does best in slot matter? Why should you get it? From rating the casual content, there are a couple of reasons that are worth considering. First of all, do more damage. The obvious winners here are people who care about parsing. There's a large community of players that use a website called FFXIV to help track and analyze their performance, which mainly shows how much damage they're doing. This can be quite competitive with people competing to be the best, which translate into doing as much DPS as possible. If you care about this, getting best in slot is mandatory. The website ranks you based on your DPS, and a lot of people care about it. And just like parsing, the same can be said for speeds, which is where players race to kill the boss as fast as possible. You obviously want to do as much damage as you can if that's your goal. Damage can also matter in high-end content even if you don't do speeds or parsing. Savage fights often have DPS checks, which means that if you don't kill the boss quickly enough, it'll wipe the party with an enraged mechanic. The better your gear, the more likely it is that you can kill the boss in time. Now certainly in the community, the DPS checks are considered very generous in this tier, but not everybody is going to have clean runs with no deaths, so doing as much damage as you can could indeed be the difference between getting it clear or not. The benefits here start to matter a lot more for weaker players or groups. This is especially important for ultimate encounters. For many, ultimates are the biggest reason to get best in slot gear because this content is where DPS checks can be the strictest. These fights are some of the hardest in the game, so you need every advantage that you can get. Lots of people would say that this is the main point of best in slot, the big justification to get it in the first place. It gives the gear meaning and real value and can be pointed at as being the difference between getting it clear or not. This is why by the time an ultimate is released, players have had time to gear up from the current Savage tier. Something else to consider is more damage gives you the chance to skip mechanics. Killing before a major mechanic can also help because a shorter fight means less room for mistakes. It's pretty easy to understand why this is useful. And speaking of mistakes, better gear means more health. I should note here that you technically don't need best in slot for more HP, because both tome gear and raid gear share the same vitality values. Either will help, so you might as well get what gives you the most damage in any case. Best in slot also means that you can speed through roulettes and other forms of content. Faster content means more time saved. If this matters to you, best in slot's still the way to go. And lastly, if you like glams, you need to have the augmented tome and savage gear if you want to dye those pieces. While I don't think that most people are raiding just to dye an outfit, it's certainly a nice benefit and one that I personally really appreciate since I love how a lot of the raid gear looks in the game. If you're this far into the video, consider subscribing, joining the channel as a member for exclusive updates, or joining the Discord. And let me know in the comments that you made it this far and what your personal thoughts are on the best in slot gear. If you want to talk about it in real time, I have a forum post for every video I've made in my Discord where you can chat with me directly, so join up if you're looking for deeper discussion. Anyway, why are people saying that best in slot is irrelevant? Let's look at the current tier. I mentioned previously that ultimates are a big deal for best in slot gear. What's important to remember about ultimates is that they have a strict item level sync, which means that the gear that comes out after the ultimate isn't necessarily going to be better. This is why we still use Abyssos gear for best in slot sets in the Omega protocol. The reason for this is a mixture of stat allocation differences and the benefits of materia and Abyssos gear, which you don't get when your gear is synced down. This is also why dungeon gear ends up being useful for ultimates, because they can line up perfectly to the item level ceiling of the ultimate encounter. Because of situations like this, someone could say that the current best in slot gear is useless, and if all you care about is doing ultimates, that's not wrong. I mean, let's look at some of the points I made earlier. Outside of when ultimates are current, pretty much everything is doable without best in slot. It just makes things easier. You'll still get good enough damage if all you do is farm weekly tomes, and then upgrade them once the weekly Alliance raid coins come out. For some people, the joy of the game comes from clearing itself. The gear is just a side bonus. I know people who will clear the tier once and then forget about it because they have no use for the gear and don't want to deal with reclears. Savage content also just isn't easy for everyone, despite what you may read from your favorite raider personalities. It can take a lot of time and effort, especially if you're in Party Finder or have a bad static, and well, finding a good static can take a lot of time too. A lot of people would probably like it if they could play with others around their skill level, but the reality of this game is that it's not easy to find that. Why grind and put so much time into gear that you don't really get much use out of anyway? There are no ultimates coming out at this point, so the Anabasios gear is just going to be used for the first few levels of Dawn Trail until Dungeon and Story gear starts to replace it. If you're only going to clear for the accomplishment, you don't care about having more damage for faster reclears, and outside of Savage, the gearing advantage for things like roulettes only matters when the content isn't synced anyway. Your Endwalker best in slot doesn't matter if you end up in old Alliance raids. And even when it does matter, some people don't care if they're shaving off a few seconds or even minutes off their clear time. Just because you have best in slot doesn't mean that the other 23 players do as well. The point of this is that, to put it very simply, best in slot can matter, but it just depends a lot on your goals and priorities. I think for a lot of people, they chase best in slot because it is the goal, and that's fine, but hopefully after this video, more people will consider what they plan on doing with it. For most people, especially casual players who don't engage with Savage raiding, you can get by with the gear that you get from normal and Alliance raids. You definitely don't need best in slot to tackle extreme trials either. One thing I do want to mention though is even if you decide to not get best in slot, if you're doing high-end content, please consider upgrading your tome gear once the Alliance raid coins come out. It'll still help a lot because the increased health values can be the difference between living and dying when you get hit. If you don't really enjoy doing reclears, maybe you don't need to chase it and can do something else. And if you do or have bigger goals to leverage it, that's fine too. In any case, you should be proud of what you earned. Just think about why you want to earn it in the first place. Like I said at the start, if best in slot is irrelevant depends on who you are, and hopefully you can better answer that for yourself now. Take it easy and I'll see you in the next one.